Hello. Thank you very much for coming to this seminar. We have Julian here today. Most of you know him. He's going to talk about a topic that I think is extremely interesting. I'm looking forward to it. So we'll have this half an hour seminar. It's actually 20 minutes and then 10 minutes for questions. And then we will go upstairs. We have some snacks on the table, and we don't have drinks anymore. Someone drank them. So we will need to figure out a way of if someone knows some soft drinks that are okay when they're warm, that would be great, and I will buy them. But I prepared for that possibility. So we have 30 Coke no sugars in the fridge downstairs. So I will take them upstairs. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Howard. I assume hopefully everyone can hear me online as well. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be back in many, many ways and see familiar faces. I am obviously pressed for time here, so I won't do too much by way of background before we get into this. But just as a bit of context, some of the stuff I'm talking about here really draws on the experience I've had for the past 3 years being based back in the UK, where at least from a government level, policies on both carbon and biodiversity credits have moved on quite quickly and were already at sort of a later stage than Australia in a few ways. So it's quite interesting to compare some of the things I've been seeing over there with where we are here. But I won't dwell too much on the background. I really want to provide a bit of introduction first on what we mean by carbon and biodiversity credits, which won't be news to you, I'm sure, and then outline obviously the difference between the compliance and the voluntary market, and we are focusing here more on the voluntary market. Put a bit of context here on the Nature Repair Act, just to reinforce that what we're talking about does have international relevance, and particularly here, given recent legislation as well. And then I want to get into really the nub of what I've been looking at for the past 18 months or so, is really how the expansion of both carbon and biodiversity voluntary credit markets impacts rights holders. So you can use phrases indigenous peoples and local communities, but there's a bit of pushback about that at the moment. So what I'm more interested here is in how we can identify these principles of fairness, equity and justice to rights holders who are engaged in both the voluntary carbon and biodiversity credit markets. So I'll speak for 20 minutes and then obviously we've got good 10 minutes for questions and afterwards as well. Can I mix some? Here you go. Okay. No, we're not working. Oh, there we are. Okay, I have to use the mouse. So let's just put all these up, otherwise I'll be messing around. So we all, obviously, a carbon credit, a measurable and verifiable unit of emissions reduction. So we obviously have to distinguish here when we're talking about carbon credits between the compliance market, the long established larger market, cap and trade, ETS, and so on, which involves obviously governments setting limits on mainly industrial emissions and industries engaging in various trading activities between one another to achieve those targets, which are hopefully reduced over time in line with international commitments towards greenhouse gas emission reductions. And we've got the voluntary market, which is a relatively new entry into the carbon market sector and a lot smaller. So clearly various scales of significance, of magnitude, different. And what we're looking at here is voluntary actions, mainly by private sector, but state sector organisations as well, to meet internally set reduction goals. So these are not government established by and large. They generally tend to be voluntary, and we'll look at the motives in a second. But the idea here is that through supporting and investing in emissions reduction activities or activities which serve to sequester or reduce carbon emissions, then credits can be bought and may be used as offsets against the corporate impact on the natural environment, or retired completely and therefore taken out of the market and not being traded onwards. So this is really a voluntary activity. And, sorry, I've scooted forward a little bit. When we're thinking about the reasons why organisations might seek to engage in biodiversity credits. Firstly, we have to realise that these are apples and oranges. It's incredibly difficult to equate a single, easily measured, universally applicable metric like a carbon credit to biodiversity. And a lot of the discussion has been about how do we measure an uplift in biodiversity? Is there a suite of metrics which can be identified, never mind a single one, which people can agree upon? And that's really not been the case so far, but there might not be a need for a single metric. I mean, we have different currencies, we have different ways of measuring all sorts of things around the world. It doesn't necessarily have to aspire to this goal of a carbon credit situation, which is itself unique. So when we're thinking about biodiversity credits, it is this uplift in biodiversity. It can be at species level, can be at habitat level or ecosystem level. And when we're thinking about the markets that are associated with this, there is a relatively small compliance market, which by and large is confined to actually not even the UK, but England, which has introduced a biodiversity net gain principle, which essentially says if you want to develop something, like say housing estate for ease of comparison, then basically you have to demonstrate that at the end of all of that activity, the biodiversity has improved by 10%. It's a contentious thing, but it has spurred research into how do we actually measure this, which is all part of the interesting thing. And why would companies, apart from the compliance market, why would organisations be involved in voluntary purchasing of biodiversity credits? There are a number of internal reasons you could think. It could be self-interest, in that a company is in one way or another dependent upon natural resources, and therefore it's in their interest to invest in activities which sustain those. Or there could be some external drivers. It could be unlikely to be regulatory in most senses, but there's a big reputational element to this in terms of companies wanting to be seen to be doing the right thing or differentiating their products in the market and so on. So there are various drivers which have contributed towards private sector interest in trading in biodiversity credits on this voluntary basis, notwithstanding these issues of difficulty of measurement and so on. But the relevant, really the interesting thing here is putting us in the broader context of funding when we're looking at biodiversity goals, principally the 30 by 30 CBD goals to achieve 30% effective conservation of the land and sea by 2030. If we're going to get anywhere near that, then there's got to be considerable change in the funding environment, because currently most of the funding towards biodiversity conservation comes from governments, and you can see the difference between what is spent annually and what is needed annually if we are, broadly speaking, to get anywhere near those 30 by 30 goals. And within that funding gap, the role of biodiversity credits and biodiversity offsets occupies a significant space. So there is a lot of impetus and a lot of pressure from various reasons pushing companies towards getting involved in the buying, the buying mainly of biodiversity credits. And there are sort of broader initiatives, the Task Force for Nature Disclosure, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, I think I've got that acronym wrong, which are basically lists of companies who have met certain standards and therefore can be position themselves as leaders in this field of investing in biodiversity, in doing the right thing. We do have to differentiate between carbon and biodiversity credits on the market though. Now, if you want to buy and sell a carbon credit, relatively easy. But obviously, if you are engaged in some form of forestation and therefore sequestering carbon and selling the carbon gains from that as carbon credits, then there are biodiversity benefits with what you're doing as well. So Whether you seek to establish a market which is solely trading in carbon or solely trading in biodiversity credits, or looking at some means of putting those two things together and selling them either separately or as part of an integral package, which is the bundled approach, there are many ways you can do this. The obvious risk here is double counting and making sure that if you are engaged in this sort of activity, then you're selling what you're saying you're doing, and you're not over egging the pudding, and we'll come to some examples of that later. But capturing these broad, the full range of ecosystem services through the use of both biodiversity and carbon credits obviously speaks to a broader range of issues that we are concerned with. So looking at the markets now, it's really complicated. And firstly, if we look at the voluntary, so we're not looking at the compliance markets here, it's just the voluntary markets. You can see the multiplicity of organisations that are set up with actually setting up the schemes, providing some sort of registry or standards through which the supposed carbon credit gains can be measured and verified. And then you've got all the sales mechanisms, and there's all sorts of really interesting developments here about blockchain and ensuring transparency and so on, ending up with the purchasers over there on the right. So it's an extraordinarily complicated market. Where do we find carbon credits worldwide? And again, this is interesting. We'll come back to a couple of these points later. It's not just in the developed or developing world. It's very broad. And if you actually take North America out of that picture there, you can see a lot of the credits are issued within what we would call the developing world, certainly areas of highest biodiversity and forest loss. And what sort of activities are covered under carbon credits? Mainly forestry, but also renewables. And that obviously makes sense. These are the things we can invest in fairly quickly and demonstrate a gain in one form or another through issuance of carbon credits. And again, briefly, I will rush through a little bit of this. The voluntary biodiversity credit market is equally complex, even though it's, as we said, a lot smaller. It's an extremely complicated situation in terms of the number of organisations, both in terrestrial and marine environments, that are seeking to monetize what they're doing in terms of biodiversity conservation. And then all the people monitoring these different metrics and pushing for their own metrics to be used, whether they're satellite or on the ground, or all sorts of other really interesting ways in which you can measure the impact. And again, the sellers and the end users. Now, where do we find biodiversity credit schemes operating? These are, because the market is so much smaller, these are actually individual schemes. Are listed over there on the right, but you can see we've got a few in Australia. South Pole were, I think, one of the first to start issuing biodiversity credits here. Up in Europe and in South America as well, as quite a lot of activity. And just briefly touching back here in Australia and highlighting the fact that under the Nature Repair Act allows for the issuance basically of biodiversity credits in the form of biodiversity certificates, which basically, and I won't do this justice in a few sentences, but if you can demonstrate a biodiversity uplift to the regulator, you can get a certificate issued. This is mainly geared towards landowners, and you have to follow a methodology of accounting for what you're saying you're doing, of verifying what you're saying you're doing, and that's the Accounting for Nature system, which was set up by an offshoot of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists and has a lot of support domestically as a metric. You get the certificate, you get it registered, and you can then sell that. You can sell it if you want to the federal or state government, or more importantly now, given the introduction of the safeguard mechanism, which will not severely, but considerably restrict industrial emissions and therefore spur interest in industries purchasing carbon credits, you can staple, you can attach these biodiversity certificates to your carbon credit units and enhance the value. So again, going back to what we're saying about representing the broad range of ecosystem services. So this is quite an interesting development from a number of reasons. But getting back into moving towards the issues of fairness and equity in this market, who is operating in these markets, and what is the power relationships involved in setting up a scheme, selling the credits, and then deciding what to do with the monetary benefits that you get from selling those credits? So this isn't the best illustration of the voluntary credit market, and it's specific to carbon, but you could put biodiversity in there as well. It really applies to them both. So you've got, in this diagram at least, groups called landowners and farmers, who are actually what I would call the rights holders, and they engage in a relationship with project developers, who then work with the brokers and retailers. You've got the end buyers, and there are standards, obviously the verification process going on as well. So from that perspective, your rights holders are supplying the raw materials into the market, and by and large, they are price takers. So although obviously the quality of what they're selling, if you like, in terms of the biodiversity and the cachets associated with, say, more unique habitats will vary, they really are not setting the price in this situation. They are taking the price. And that reflects the fact, I think, that you've also obviously got very powerful organizations and stakeholders further up the chain that are pushing for the expansion of a biodiversity and carbon credit market on a voluntary basis. So your big international NGOs, governments and so on, and obviously industry as well. I think the standard setters occupy a really crucial role here, because they're the, if you want to be a bit cynical about it, they are the only really independent, and there are limits to that as well, arbiters in this value chain, in the are people getting a fair price for what they're doing in terms of investing in biodiversity and carbon gains, and are the prices and so on, are the credits worthwhile? So particularly in developing countries, but elsewhere as well, the role of the standard setters is something we'll come back to. And I think I'll move on from that. The point here is a lot of this activity has got a very bad name, particularly in the last 18 months. There was a series of reports, some of which are, to be fair, more justified than others, I would say, in terms of the evidence base. But there is a strong evidence base that, particularly in the carbon market, the supposed gains in terms of the amount of carbon sequestered or absorbed or not emitted in the first place, so avoided emissions reductions, has been overstated. And you see the Guardian newspaper is the sole source of all of these. It has reported quite extensively on this. But the issues still remain, despite that negative publicity. And I think in a new market with a real lack of oversight and regulation, you always have some bad examples. There will be mistakes, and there will be deliberate attempts to defraud people, absolutely. But they will not persist, because they can't in the market. And it could be, I think, over time, people still hope that despite that negative publicity, both the carbon and biodiversity credit markets can continue to expand. And fundamentally, and this is sort of reflects an earlier other research interest, this is a really potentially significant stream of funding for conservation, particularly in protected areas, as well as community development and so on. So when we're looking at this credit quality issue, how do we know and how do we prove that we are buying what we're being touted, in the sense of reductions in carbon emissions and also biodiversity gain? We have the need to demonstrate additionality. So what you're buying, what you're supporting, wouldn't have just happened otherwise under any other policy. And big hydro power plants suffer from this, because governments are going to build those anyway. They can't really say, oh, that's only because of the carbon credits that are gained. The permanence, that these activities will not be reversed, and you're not simply displacing, say, deforestation to other places through supporting your reforestation activities, but more importantly, from my point of view, the co-benefits. So what happens to the money? At the end of that value chain, basically, farmers, landowners, and credit holders, their land is being used for a particular purpose. What is the financial benefits that return to local communities? And how can we establish some sorts of principles? And what I've been doing is basically, if you look at the idea of carbon and biodiversity, they're nothing new. We've been doing payments for ecosystem services for over 30 odd years. But there are shared elements in the ecosystem service transaction with the carbon and biodiversity credits. So in brief, to try and establish some principles, we spent a fair amount of time basically going through the PES literature to try and identify some principles. And I'll finish up with this slide. I'll come back to this in the questions if you like, because I am on the final slide now. This is where I ended up as a framework to try and look at the relationships that are involved in ensuring that at the end of the day, there is equity and justice, free, prime and informed consent, and a recognition of community values and cultural values in this process of establishing a credit market. And the arrows sort of indicate the relationships between those. And fundamentally, you need secure land tenure and ownership. It seems to be a very strong message from the literature. From that starting point, so it's not, you don't have contested claims to land or the resources, you can start to establish appropriate methods of payment, form, timing. Do landowners get paid individually? Do they get paid collectively? What is the conditionality associated with those payments? What system of monitoring and enforcement are you going to have? And that, again, feeds back from the ability and willingness to participate. And I think the message is, a lot of the verification schemes that we've got do not consider any of this. They're only concerned with the metric, the biodiversity metric, the carbon metric, not actually how much of that credit, the revenue from those credit sales, is being returned to local communities and how. And I think if you don't address that, you're going to return to these problems of badly regulated markets, negative publicity, and we're eventually going backwards. So I think this is a really interesting area. We recently published some of this, actually just came out this week, which is nice. Myself and Kathleen have talked a bit about some of these issues about biodiversity credits in that paper. And the literature review I mentioned earlier should hopefully be coming out soon in ecosystem services. But at the end of the day, it's paying due regard to rights holders, which is where I think we need to focus. I really should stop now. Thank you. Yeah, Margaret.
Thanks, Julian. One of the slides where you had the system of biodiversity markets.
What's the front?
Yeah, it was probably that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
You talk about standard setters.
Yes.
So are there also verification agencies already for biodiversity credit?
These, their title includes verification. Standard and verification sort of go together, I think, in this category. So
those certified.
Yeah. Vera, they're the big ones, and Plan Vivo, they're the two biggest. And they include some elements of biodiversity, but it's very, very broad. And in fact, it boils down to, are you meeting these SDGs? You tick a box. There's no demonstrable proof required. And so
Vera now lost all credibility because
a couple of those examples in, was it South Africa or Zimbabwe, I think? Yeah. I don't agree with some of the evidence base that was used in some of those articles. It's not entirely clear, but it had the impact without a doubt. And Vera have had to reconsider some of what they're doing, but there's still very little about revenues of all of that money that you make from selling the carbon credits. What percentage goes back? And there are some of these some of the actual scheme operators say we will return 60 or even 70% of credit sales. So you're wondering how on earth they're running their operation when everything that they do is based on 30% of credit sales revenue. But that's what they're saying. Although, again, how do you verify that? How do you know that's happening? And as I was saying, all the attention is very much on measuring trees and measuring species, and not actually what is happening at the end of the day to the people whose resources are being used for this purpose. So that's what it's... Michael? Sorry.
When you get an obscure question like mine, could you just summarise it for the online guys?
Oh, yes, sorry, of course. Sorry, I realised this, yeah. Yeah. Michael's asking an obscure question, everyone. Sorry.
Well, the idea that the standards agency should be actually being concerned about how the money flows or whatever, that just seems to be about, this is about voluntary participation, and you know, I'm offering to do this, I'm getting the money, I'm going to use this to change my land use practice. That's up to me. If you want to get the equity thing, I don't think I'm just wondering why the standards people do it. I just want to know that if I'm buying the credit, it actually is what it says on the tin. And if they can do that, that's what they should be doing. And then issues about regional development happen somewhere else outside that role of just being sure that the product is what it is. That seems a big enough challenge.
Okay, so I think we're talking here about the issue of knowing that you're getting what you pay for as the buyer of that credit, and then the issue of are you or you're not concerned about what happens to the money that you have paid through that process. Would that summarize the vague question? Okay, so I agree, you might not be bothered, but if you were a big organization, say L'Oreal are really big in this space, and your website is all about your corporate social responsibility, would you want to take a risk of putting all of that money, buying all those credits and being associated with a scheme which then is exposed in The Guardian as displacing local communities? Because that can happen if the flow of money into the area where the reforestation or whatever it is taking place is not subject to some sort of external scrutiny. I don't think you do it in other areas. You know, if you do due diligence when you buy a car, I see this as due diligence as well on behalf of that company to say to the standard setters, you need to include this in your program or your standards, whatever it is that you've established, beyond this very rudimentary level that is currently present.
Is it like not buying clothes that have been made with slave labour sort of thing?
Yeah, you could say that's a much better example than my crude attempt. But yeah.
Is it many developing countries?
No, you will, well, Australia, you see it's happening here. The biodiversity credit situation is expanding rapidly, but there is greater transparency, there's greater regulation. And even South Polo got themselves into severe trouble with their biodiversity credits here. Although obviously that was an operation overseas, but it damaged their reputation within Australia.
It's more on this side.
Yeah. And there is something which I haven't touched on, is some of these companies issue the credits as well. So they're really marking their own homework, aren't they? That is something which Plan Vivo and Vera both suffer from. Not all of them do that. Silvera, for example, they don't issue their own credits. But if I come to you, if Herman is Vera, and I say I've got this great scheme, if you verify it, we can make all this money, and Vera makes some percentage from issuing those credits and being the issuer and trader, well, there's something a bit fishy, which doesn't really help the overall transparency. Yeah, sorry. Hi, Matt.
At a bigger picture,
yeah,
the thing that scares me, I think, that all of this is like that funding gap, and then pointing to these markets and voluntary things as part of the solution. And I'm seeing signals from the Australian government, for example, getting away from addressing that funding gap and just incentivizing private investment. I wonder if you had a perspective on, is this voluntary incentivization of private investment the way to go, or is it a kind of
Crowding out government
is
funding.
it crowding out the government
It's
funding?
just an excuse not to do anything.
It could be an excuse for governments not to do something, absolutely. But given what you've seen for the past 10 years, do you really imagine the governments are going to fund more? I don't. And I think that's one political way to look at it. But another way to look at it is a sort of rights and responsibilities. If a corporate sector is having an impact on the environment, then they should be obligated to not remedy, but address that impact in one way or another. And this is one way to do that. And I think in the ASX 200, there are about 60 companies that have signed up to the Science-Based Targets for Nature, Science-Based Targets Initiative. So that's a pretty useful indicator of how the bigger companies do view this. Helen.
Thank you.
It's the right word.
Oh,
So
all right.
yeah.
Are we good?
But if you're like Jen who has questions, or if you're like me, I want to ask you many questions.
Yeah.
We can go upstairs and get
Yeah.
some soft drinks and some snacks and
Yeah.
keep the conversation there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you.